Hello and welcome to this session of Bibliotopia. My name is Matthew Wake, and I own an English bookshop in Lausanne. And today we're very happy to welcome the American writer, translator, and critic Jennifer Croft, who is here currently in residence at the Foundation. Amongst her many achievements, Jennifer is the recipient of a Fulbright scholarship. She holds a PhD in Comparative Literary Studies, and her work has appeared in publications such as the New York Times, LitHub, and The Guardian. She's possibly best known as the translator of the 2018 Man Booker Prize for her translation of Olga Tokarczuk's Flight. This session is called Language, Illness, and a Sisterly Bond, a Memoir of Adolescence, which I guess is in reference to your book, Homesick, which was published last year. I've read the book, I really enjoyed it, but perhaps for people who haven't read the book, can you tell us a little bit about what it's about?
Yeah, absolutely. So Homesick is a coming-of-age story. I wrote it as a novel originally in Spanish because I was living in Argentina at the time, and it took on a different life in English, partly because I wanted to create at the beginning an effective distance to suggest the kind of journey that the narrator is going to be on from this very stifling and illness-filled home to this kind of freedom of language and travel at the end. So although the narrative goes in chronological order, the photographs in the book, which are in color and black and white, go in reverse chronological order, more or less, and always have to do with the text, but often in a kind of complicated way that may even undermine what's being said. And what's being said is that there is this character who is based on me, named Amy, who has a very close relationship with her sister, younger sister, Zoe, who is based on my sister, Anne-Marie, who now calls herself Zoe, because we both agree that's a better name. Even our father now calls her Zoe. And Zoe gets really sick when she is 5 years old, and that sort of calls into question everything that Amy thought she understood about the world. She was a very organized person who always liked predictability and photography precisely because it allows her to freeze people and prevent anything from ever changing. So it's the story of how Amy grapples over her entire adolescence with this huge shift in her worldview that's sort of forced upon her.
Yeah, I thought it was quite interesting because, obviously you told this story, although it's about you and your sister, in the third person, and you gave both names, Amy and Zoe. And I also felt that you resisted the urge to sort of look back as the narrator at these childhood events and sort of impose your thoughts on those events. And I just wondered why you made those choices. Why did you tell the story as you told it?
So what I wanted to do when I was writing the original, which is called Serpientes y escaleras, it's without photographs in Spanish, and what I wanted to do was create these small vignettes that would essentially be Polaroid photographs in themselves. So they're frozen moments, and it would be impossible to change them with my current perspective, just as it would be impossible for me to alter in any real way a Polaroid photograph that I took in my childhood. And the third person thing, I mean, that's part of the photography, but also because I intended this to be a novel, and I chose the names for their etymologies, and it also, of course, allows me a different kind of distance, and obviously I'm not a neutral teller of this story, but it prevents me from over-sentimentalizing or over-interiorizing these events.
It's quite interesting on this idea of being overly sentimental, because you're not sentimental at all about the characters. So, for example, Zoe, you're very happy to tell us that she whinges a lot, And it's a really nice sort of warts and all description of that time. But given that it's warts and all, was that difficult to do, given the fact I understand that you're still quite a close family?
Yes. Well, actually, my sister, so I started sending my sister these vignettes as I was writing them, and that's actually how it went from Spanish into English. So my original plan was just to publish this in Spanish. I felt more comfortable with that. This is my first book of my own, although I've published a number of translations. And I felt shy about telling this story, which includes information that not even my closest friends had about me during the period of adolescence. But I wanted to share the parts about my sister with my sister from the beginning, so I made these sections in English. And she is totally delighted to be in the book, especially now that there are pictures of her in it. So she always believes that Oprah Winfrey is going to call us at some point and invite my sister to be on the show. Or something like that will happen. So she feels like a celebrity now, and she's quite pleased.
Excellent. Just on this idea of the vignettes, because I think in a certain way there's two ways to read your book. Obviously, you can read the narrative, and then through the narrative there are these photographs, and they always come with the text. And it feels if you just read the text with the photographs, it feels like you are writing a very personal letter in a way to your sister. Is that the way that you envisaged it?
Yeah. So the idea of the color photographs, which kind of alternate with the main narrative, was not only to enrich the main narrative, but also to put basically the ending of the book in which I don't know if this isn't exactly a spoiler, but I mean, of course, part of the goal of the book is clear from the beginning, which is to simultaneously let go in a healthy way of a loved one, while also kind of allowing that loved one to achieve the status of a full-fledged human with real feelings and desires that the letter writer, who is Amy in this case, can relate to. So she writes this letter at the end of the book, and you read it throughout, and it kind of contextualizes what she's saying, which is often about language, but language viewed through the lens of who are we and how do we become who we are, and what do we do with our history. So if we look at the etymologies of words, it's kind of a nice way to think about how unexpected our trajectories are and how impossible it is to predict or control the fate of anything that has anything to do with the human.
I remember one of the captions, it's something like, the more you take a word for granted, the less meaning it has. And I certainly got the impression as a reader that every word was chosen with extraordinary care. And obviously you have a deep vocabulary to choose from. So I'm wondering why you called the novel Homesick. I mean, that was, I'm sure, a very deliberate choice.
Yeah, I love the word homesick. I really love these Anglo-Saxon words that sound very naive, but also very powerful at the same time. And of course, I like the idea of home not only being the locus of domestic bliss, but also can be of illness or of toxicity, or there are many people who have to flee their childhood homes in order to create a real home for themselves. So it's partly a reference to that, and partly I love the word, which is a lot of this has to do with untranslatability or the impossibility of reproducing exactly what happened in the past in photography as well. And I think homesick is a really interesting challenge to translators. For example, now it's being translated into Korean and Polish, and there is no real equivalent to the word homesick for the title. And my own title in Spanish is very different. It means Snakes and Ladders, which is the name of a childhood game, which has to do with fate, or that is not really a reference to nostalgia.
So part of the story in Homesick is obviously your sister's illness. I mean, she had a brain tumor. I understand that she had at least 2 operations, and you were in the ambulance with her when she was having these seizures, when she seemed to sort of leave her body, which must have been extremely distressing for you. And I'm just wondering what effect your sister's illness had on you, I guess in terms of your development or how you saw the world.
Yeah, I think the most immediate effect was that I became a vegetarian when I was 9, because I was so shocked when I kind of realized the permeability of the body, and I began to think about what mortality was, and I had never given any consideration to those things before. And I remember that my family, I grew up in Oklahoma, and my relatives even have like farms, and I grew up in a very meat-eating culture, and I remember we were going somewhere and we pulled off the highway to have hamburgers for lunch, and I just took a bite and I couldn't swallow it, and my throat closed up, and I never was able to eat meat again after that. And it was another way in which I kind of became isolated from the rest of my family, which was, of course, very focused on my sister, maybe not in the most helpful ways to my sister either. So another thing that did was exacerbate my pre-existing tendency to try to control my sister in the sense of protecting her, but also smothering her in many ways. So, and that continued for a while. But hopefully, well, you'd have to ask her whether that continues to this day.
We'll have to wait for the Oprah Winfrey episode when you're both on.
Yeah, we have to wait for her memoirs, or more likely the TV show in which she appears.
Excellent. Just to continue talking about your sister, during the book you seemed, at certain moments, very close to her. I think there's even a moment where you mentioned that you're not quite sure which memories are yours and which memories are hers. And I've just thought of another question, which I should maybe ask. First of all, how do you disentangle those memories?
Yeah, well, that line was prompted because you mentioned the ambulance scene, which was one of the first vignettes that I wrote, which was that when we were in school, my sister began to have this episode, and no one knew what it was. We had no idea that it was a seizure or that she had a brain tumor at that point. And I was called out of my math test that I was doing, and I was taken in the ambulance with her to the hospital. And I remembered that very vividly. And I workshopped the first 10 pages of this book at a Tin House magazine workshop in Portland, Oregon. And some of the people in my workshop were saying, well, this is obviously impossible, and this couldn't have been, at first they wouldn't have let you ride in the ambulance, and this and that and whatever. And so I went to my sister afterwards, and I said, oh, these people are such idiots. They just, don't understand anything. And my sister said, well, that wasn't the first time that I had a seizure. And I had completely blocked out, in fact, the first time, which was a different story entirely. And so she told me that story, and that's, I think, the one instance in the book where I just had to trust her memory, and I created a new vignette that precedes that ambulance scene, which, it doesn't address they did let me ride in the ambulance, and maybe that's not something that's done anymore, but that is what happened, and there's some consensus in the family about that. But at that point, we did actually know that it was a seizure, so I misremembered some things, and I, didn't remember. I still have no real memory of my own of this other event that she somehow does, although she was having a seizure. So it's mysterious, and I think when you're really close to someone, I have this now with my husband that sometimes I don't remember what I said or what he said, and I notice that he takes credit for what I brilliantly said very frequently, which is frustrating, but I think, it happens a lot.
That's it. It's interesting that you bring that up, because so much of your life is focused on words and their meanings, and I said their etymologies and their translations. And when we look at some of the stories that or the experiences that you and your sister told, a lot of it was about writing codes. I think you were learning Russian, she was learning Polish, if I remember correctly. Ukrainian, thank you. But she never learnt your codes. So
I've never forgiven her for that.
And rightly so.
Yeah, I was always really interested in symbols and language for some reason, and coding, which I guess is another form of, trying to control and freeze. And also I wanted a channel to communicate with my sister without our parents being involved, because they were just always ruining all of my amazing plans for us. So I devised all of these secret alphabets, none of which ever really took on with my sister. But and then we both started studying Slavic. We were homeschooled after my sister's brain tumor, and kind of left to our own devices. And we wanted to start studying Slavic languages, but we refused to study the same language. So my sister took Ukrainian, and I did Russian, but that did nothing to enhance our communication with each other.
Funny. Just going back to something which you mentioned earlier, about the fact that you, I think, started writing this book in Argentinian Spanish. I'm intrigued why you made that choice.
Partly just because I was living in Buenos Aires. I lived there for 7 years and continued to be very connected to Argentina and to publish there and to translate writers from there. And partly because I wrote it while I was writing my PhD dissertation. And if you have ever read a PhD dissertation, you know that the style is often excruciatingly convoluted. And it was really hard for me to break away from that for creative writing, for fiction or creative nonfiction. And something that I found weirdly helpful was my limitations in Spanish. So I started studying Spanish in my late 20s, and obviously I don't have native level of Spanish, and I never will. So I wrote in this kind of very colloquial, very rooted to Buenos Aires, which has its own, unique form of Spanish, and also obviously foreign. And I had to know exactly what I wanted to say before I began a sentence, and that was just such a great focusing thing for me, and also kind of emotionally, like I sort of alluded to before, I felt more comfortable. It was also, it wouldn't have occurred to me to talk about, the first scene that I wrote is about a tornado arriving in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where I grew up, and I began to kind of remember and describe these places that I knew in my childhood. It would never have occurred to me to do that for an American reader or audience. And, afterwards I sort of realized that there are Americans for whom that is still a kind of exotic place. But my idea initially was that for an Argentine reader, like a tornado is a great way to get their interest at the beginning.
Is that, you've, in your interviews before, you've sort of made this distinction between Argentinian Spanish and Castilian Spanish. Are they, in what ways are they different?
My distinction is really just, so I always had this, I ended up majoring in English and Russian at university in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and minoring in creative writing, and I went to combine those three elements. I went to do a Master's of Fine Arts in Literary Translation, and I always had this idea, once I decided that I would translate, that I would have to live in the place in order to be able to translate from there, because there are so many little elements of daily life that it is impossible to get in any other way. And if you don't understand the rhythm and kind of the gestures that accompany the things people say, and what is really a cliche and what is really, a different way of formulating something for a totally different effect, then I think you can't really translate. I couldn't really translate faithfully, whatever that means, if I didn't have all of that information. So the real reason that I make the distinction for my own work is that I learned Spanish in Argentina, and I've only ever lived in Buenos Aires. So I wouldn't feel comfortable translating a text from, Madrid, because I've spent 2 days in Madrid, and really can't, I cannot fully interpret what people are meaning when they say these words. I can look up the words in the dictionary, but that doesn't really help.
So you have, excuse me, you have, I think, perhaps 3 Argentinian Spanish books that you've translated. August by Romina Paula, A Perfect Symmetry by Federico Falco, and The Woman from Uruguay. Were these books that you chose yourself, or were you commissioned?
No, I've always chosen the books myself, and I have a couple more coming. I always choose books that really appeal to me or that I even fall in love with. And I think it's hard to predict exactly how my voice is going to interact with theirs. So it's always kind of it's like beginning a new relationship every time I embark upon a new text, even when I've translated the author before sometimes. So I always viewed translation as a kind of apprenticeship in writing, and each of those writers that you mentioned is really different. Federico Falco is like a really gorgeous kind of classical stylist who's super well read in international literature. Romina Paula is an actress, and she writes plays and she directs plays, so she's really less interested in language and more interested in the interactions between people and how to kind of get across what they're thinking and what their motivations are and how to really convey emotion. She's superb at that. So, I take these different elements from these different people. Pedro Mairal's book, The Woman from Uruguay, is a page-turner. I mean, it's really like, I advocated to do the translation really quickly because he wrote it in a kind of fever dream, and I translated it really fast to correspond to that. And I also wanted to do it quickly so that it could come out in May in time for, people taking it on vacation, if there's such a thing as going on vacation, which remains to be seen. But and from him, it's, that's a great way to learn about how to create suspense. It's literary fiction. It's not a genre novel, but it's something that you want to read really fast, and you're worried about the characters in it.
So are there themes? I mean, are there common themes in those 3 books, or are they all actually very, very different?
I guess they're all different. I mean, there are some. So Fede's collection is called A Perfect Cemetery, and it is short stories. And there's a wonderful short story in it called Sylvie and Her Dark Night, and that's a coming-of-age story. Romina's book, August, is also kind of coming-of-age story, as is mine. Pedro's is the story of an affair and of kind of a writer reaching middle age and not understanding where his life has gone. So it's kind of thematically... Yeah, I think the books that I've translated also from Polish have had really different themes, but there's this kind of uniting, almost indefinable thread of things that Jennifer Croft enjoys.
Excellent. In some sense, it's a reflection of your sort of personal taste, I guess. As a translator, do you have a different connection to the book than just a normal reader has?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been argued somewhat widely that the translator is the closest reader, and although editors might not enjoy that, I do notice that writers often say that there are certain errors in the book, for instance, or miscalculations or repetitions that no one finds until they begin to be translated. So yeah, it's hard to. I feel so close to the text when I'm inside it, and then I get out of it, and maybe my recollection of it is it's definitely somewhere in between having read it and having written it. But yeah, I think the relationship is different afterwards. I think you have this lingering sense of the work in a way that might not be so dissimilar from a fan who reads the book, but of course it's different also because you have had the opportunity to actively intervene in the text, which is which then your brain is more actively processing what's happening, I guess.
And as a writer as well, I mean, you mentioned one of the authors was really great at sort of creating the suspense. Do you learn a lot as a writer about craft when you're really in these novels?
Absolutely. And I try to be mindful of what I'm taking from them so that I'm not just, plagiarizing them, which I don't think I am. But I have learned so much from those writers, from Olga Tokarczuk, from Violeta Greg, from Sylwia Siedlecka, whom I've all translated them from Polish, Natalka Sniedanko, whom I translated from Ukrainian with my one foray into Ukrainian literature. I'm so grateful for that, because I think this is really controversial what I'm going to say, but there is this kind of like standardizing tendency in the United States in contemporary literature, which many people are fighting against, but there is this element of the Masters of Fine Arts, the University of Iowa, which is actually where I did my MFA, school that kind of teaches you to write literary fiction that is, to me, very bland, but very kind of commercially potentially successful and very accessible, and you're supposed to write only what you know, and you're supposed to do this, and you're supposed to do that, and there's this emphasis on craft, which really reduces the purview of fiction in the United States, and there's it has to be so polished in this way that I often find the books that I translate aren't, and I like that they're not. There's this kind of raw ambition and this ragged or jagged quality to some of these books, and I think that's really wonderful, and it creates a totally different experience for the reader. So I think combining those different worlds and incorporating some of those foreign elements into American literature would be really helpful right now for the scene there.
That's really interesting, because when I read Homesick, it felt so fresh. It seemed sort of free from, I guess, the sort of constructs that I feel as well you do get from people who've done, or some people, not everybody, but there is a certain way which some writers are supposed to write now. And I appreciated Homesick because it wasn't like that. It's kind of, ostensibly it's very simple, the text, but in fact it's extremely complicated. And yet you veered away from, well, in the first chapter we have to create the suspense here, and then chapter 2 we have to do X and Y. So that was really nice to read.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to hear that. That was a challenge getting it published without using it. Well, it's always a challenge for me to get my translations published as well, because you're supposed to have this thing that happens at the beginning that sets up everything else, and there has to be a certain pace, which I also think is so annoying, because there's this. Again, I'm just like saying terrible things, but there's this like American consumerism, which requires that you consume and produce and consume and produce, and there's nothing in between that. So you have to consume these pages really quickly, which I think is just like an insane way of appreciating art. So I'm glad that this didn't do that.
No, it was like I say, it was such a cliche, but it felt really fresh. It felt like something very different. So in Homesick, you take us really from your early childhood right up to and a little bit beyond the moment that you won the Man Booker Prize. I think you phoned your father with the news. Tell us about. Tell us the whole story.
Yeah. So it's a great. For me, it was a great story. So I had been shopping around Olga Tokarczuk's Flights, which is my title. The original Polish title is Bieguni, which it has to do with running or fleeing, and it refers to people who belong to a Russian Orthodox sect who wanted to always be on the move in order to escape the devil. And I thought about the title for a long time and chose Flights as a way of kind of capturing that multivalence. And for a decade, I sent it to publishers, and they thought the pacing was weird, and they didn't understand, where it was going from the first pages, and it's hard to pronounce Tokarczuk. And I just get rejection after rejection after rejection, and then at last I got this message from Jacques Testard, who is the editor of Fitzcarraldo Editions in the UK, this, at the time, really new press, but I knew I had sent it to him because he had started a magazine there, co-founded a magazine called The White Review, which was wonderful, and I was just like, kind of immediately trusted his taste and his ability to make an amazing list and amazing books. So he responded, and he was really interested in doing the book and wanted to actually sign that and Olga's kind of huge novel, The Books of Jacob. And I had translated at that point about half of Flights. I had gotten some different grants in the US to be able to continue working on it, and I had published excerpts in N+1 and Bomb and some other kind of well-known cultural venues in the US. So I had about half of it, and then we really quickly did the other half. We meaning, I obviously did the translation, and he's a great editor, and got it published really quickly, and then kind of nothing happened for a little while. I mean, there were a couple of reviews that trickled in, and then all of a sudden it made the long list for the Booker, and everyone became aware of Olga. And I think when we actually, when it came down to this huge ceremony that we had in London, and from the moment that they announced us as the winners, her career, mine as well, really took off in this amazing way, and she won the Nobel Prize after that. So it's like it's a pretty good success story, and I often tell that to my translation students or other people who are struggling to begin, because I think any kind of publishing, anything that has to do with publishing, requires so much tenacity. It doesn't always. There are these famous stories where someone gets discovered when they're 12, and then they write like the great American novel at that point. But that, I think, is also really discouraging. That idea that it should be like that is really discouraging for people. So I think it's good that it took 10 years to get this published. In a way, I think it happened to also hit at the right moment in English. And that's obviously totally unpredictable. And we got a great jury for the Booker. I served on the International Booker jury this year, and I know that the process is extremely rigorous, but obviously it has to do with people's tastes. So yeah, it was a really wonderful moment, and I remain really extremely grateful to that prize for bringing so much awareness to these texts, the shortlisted texts as well. They do such a wonderful job. They just announced, of course, the winner of the English language Booker last night, but produced such a beautiful ceremony to celebrate all of the 6 books that were finalists. And I just think that's such a wonderful service for literature, and it raises the profile of those authors so much, and it's really special.
It's kind of cool, the Man Book International, because works in translation, I would argue, are probably still quite a small part of the sort of English publishing world. But they have really pushed this idea that there are other literatures out there. We can all be perhaps a little bit Anglo-centric. And I think we've seen a little bit, obviously Scandi noir will be one thing. There's some well-known Asian writers, Yoko Ogawa and other people. Which lesser known writers who have now been translated into English would you push us towards as readers?
That's a good question. So I think one thing that people are still not doing, I do think that translation is enjoying a great moment right now in the English-speaking world. I don't know how you feel about that, but I do think that when I started studying translation, no one knew what translation was. Quite literally, they didn't know what that meant, including writers. so that was a pretty dire state of affairs. There have obviously been these waves before. There was, for example, the Latin American boom, which of course was really important in American letters and elsewhere. But I think that now there's this heightened understanding and appreciation of the translator's role. But I would really encourage people to find translators whom they can trust. And then, you can just kind of go through their whole list, because often translators into English, unlike into other languages, do choose the people that they work with. So I think, a translator who was quite well known for her work with Spanish is Sophie Hughes, who's from the UK. And I really loved her translation of a Mexican writer named Laia Jufresa called Umami. Jeffrey Zuckerman has done incredibly beautiful work with French, with Ananda Devi's Eve Out of Her Ruins from Mauritius. And Damien Searles is an absolute genius, and he's like ridiculous. He translates from German and Norwegian and French and everything, and is a writer. And honestly, I would just read anything that he had translated, but we long-listed his translation of Jon Fosse, the Norwegian writer whose septology trilogy seems to be just spectacular. And then I think Frank Wynne, also, who was shortlisted for his translation of another trilogy, Virginie Despentes, Vernon Subutex. He did that's like the perfect match. You can sometimes see when you're reading a translation that this author belongs with this translator, and I think that is really the case for those books. So there's so many great options, but if you kind of allow the translator to be your guide, I think you can really start to see their voice coming through, and also see how they shed light on these writers in a really beautiful way.
Wow, I've never thought of it that way. Thank you very much. That's a really fascinating insight. Thank you. So moving on, perhaps to your sort of more recent work, you said that the Jan Michalski Foundation has been a source of great good luck for you. I guess part of that is because you've just signed a book deal for a new book. What can you tell us about it?
Yeah, so this place is extremely magical, and I am considering refusing to ever leave. Unfortunately, my husband lives in Los Angeles and might protest slightly if I tried that. But so I got really lucky. I finished writing an essay about postcards in the first week that I was here, and it's really the essay / larger project is about how we conceive of ourselves in the world, and why it's important that we are in a specific place at a specific moment, and how we communicate that to someone who is in a different moment, in a different place. And I think if we kind of trace the evolution of that perception of place and the world over the course of the 20th century, which is the time of the postcard, it can really illuminate how we have ended up here in 2020, where communication is often totally disembodied. And of course, this project was prompted by the pandemic. And if you read Homesick, which is about this young girl who's trapped in Oklahoma who is desperate to travel, and then the moment of resolution comes when she enters the world, then you can probably imagine that I was not delighted by being in lockdown. And I just started to really reflect on what mobility means and what place means, and how my relationships over the past 20 years, from the point that Homesick leaves off, have been shaped by these kinds of communications. So I wrote this essay in my first week here, and was approached really quickly by this really wonderful editor named Jonathan Lee at Catapult in the US to write a book, and develop the proposal. here, and which is also amazing because that's not even my current book project. So the project for which I received this residency is actually a novel that I've also made a lot of progress on since I've been here. So yeah, it's been really such a great opportunity to focus and also be surrounded by nature, and our tree houses are so beautiful. It's true. I mean, you can see from the auditorium, if you're watching, that there's just so much care in every design element, it makes a huge difference.
So notes on a postcard, is it again sort of creative nonfiction, or is?
Yeah, this one is creative nonfiction. I'm so surprised to be writing nonfiction, because all I ever read is fiction, and I translate fiction, and I thought this was fiction. But this Notes on Postcards is definitely more, it kind of combines a little bit of memoir with more of my academic training translated into a different language, not the excruciating PhD dissertation language. But
you're writing that in English to begin with?
Yes, I'm writing it. Yeah.
Right.
It's actually, the essay version I think has just been translated into Spanish by a friend of mine in Buenos Aires. But the process of writing a book in 2 languages is, I think, like really good for the book, but really exhausting for the brain. And I'm not sure that I would do that again. I think I would certainly leave it open to write another book in Spanish. I would love to write another book in Spanish. I would want to go back to do that to Argentina, but then someone else could translate it, which could also be a fun and interesting experience. I'm not comparing myself to Yoko Tawada, but it's interesting to look at the translations of Yoko Tawada from German by Susan Bernowski versus from her first language, which is Japanese. I think, always these multilingual experiments can be interesting and can be handled in so many different ways. So for now, for these few months, I'm having the luxury of writing in English.
Because what you're writing now is a novel. That's what you were working on here at the Mikulski.
Yes, I'm writing a slightly suspenseful, thanks to Pedro Mairal and others. I think very suspenseful, but also, again, not genre fiction. Story about 8 translators who are really obsessed with their author, who has just completed her magnum opus, who lives in a primeval forest on the border between Poland and Belarus. And they arrive eager to start work on her book, and are shocked to find her completely changed, and then the next day she disappears. And so the rest of the novel is kind of the story of their frantic search for her, and also they start to uncover things about her and about the forest that completely change the way that they view her work to that point, and also their relationships with each other.
Just perhaps a bit of an odd question, but is there like a fairy tale element to it, just because it's happening in a forest? Is that...
Yeah, so there was another resident here who is writing a book on fairy tales, and we began to exchange work. He just went back to the UK last week, but I was thinking, I hadn't actually thought about that until I started talking with him, but I think that's a really interesting element that would be good to incorporate, because there is, of course, this great tradition of kind of magical and mysterious spirits who live in the forest, and thinking of the forest itself as a really mysterious place, I think, is really fruitful. So I am incorporating some Slavic kind of folk traditions of forest creatures.
Fantastic. So just sort of a couple more questions before we finish up. Obviously, I'm sure as everyone else here, sort of very much struck by your mastery not just of English but of many other languages. And it reminds me, years ago when I lived in Japan, I was talking to this girl who was bilingual Japanese and English, and when she spoke English, she kind of slouched like an American teenager. And then when she spoke Japanese, her voice went up and she sat very, very straight. Do you feel like a different person depending on which language you're working in?
No, I definitely do, and that's, I mean, that goes back to why I felt comfortable writing this in Spanish, and why, you know, for my entire life until I moved to Argentina, I was called Jennifer, and now I prefer to be called Jenny because people there call me Jenny, and I feel like it opened up this whole element of kind of being warmer and closer and more relaxed, and I definitely have that with Spanish, and I'm sure, you know, anyone who has really like experienced a place connects the language with the culture of that place, and there would be these changes in posture and gesture and facial expression and everything, and voice. I think, yeah, when I was studying Russian, I remember as I progressed, I've unfortunately kind of abandoned my Russian, but I remember my voice got a little bit lower as I was trying to emulate I thought that was so cool at the time. I was a teenager.
So, and just on this last question about these sort of untranslatable words, you know, in Japanese there's tsundoku, which is a word I love being a bookseller, because it's when you buy books, big stacks of books, and you never read them. And obviously that's my dream, that all of my customers are like that. But do you have a favorite untranslatable word?
Well, I guess it's homesick. I mean, I like, you know, I've seen that word before because those lists were circulating a couple of years ago. These like interesting, often they come from German, right? These like long words that we can't possibly conceive of in English. And I think, you know, there is the risk. I mean, you are actually familiar with Japan, but there is the risk of kind of forgetting that one's own language is actually as rich and as mysterious and enigmatic as these other cultures that you don't know. So I always, with my students as well, try to kind of point their attention to these words that they know and that they take for granted, that are actually unique. And I think homesick is an example of that.
Great. Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure, and thank you very much.